this webinar that you can rewatch aspects of it. So we will send all of that out afterwards today. So thank you very much, Leslie, and I will turn it over to you and let you get started.
All right. Thank you so much. It's really a wonderful opportunity to be here to talk with everybody, especially at this time that is really there's so much need for us to find a way to transition through. So if people would like to have some paper to do some writing, if you want to just take a minute to grab that, because we are going to do a couple little practice exercises during the presentation today. And I just want you to be able to feel that you can be settled. So take a moment to go grab that if you need to. And whenever I begin a class or a presentation, one of the things that I always try to do is to find some place of centering and anchoring and transitioning into this new space. I'm also going to kind of lead you in a little meditation as we begin, because this might also be a helpful practice for you to lean into if at any point in time during the presentation you find you just need to kind of disconnect or find some centering again for yourself. So let's begin by invite you just in the space that you're in right now to open your eyes up and really sort of go beyond your screen and look around your room. And sometimes I tease, let's treat your space as an installation, an art installation. So you're not responsible for cleaning or picking up anything, but just look around and see if you can notice 5 things in the room around you. Just even labeling them, noticing the color, noticing the shape, maybe even noticing how the light is playing off of it. Now, I invite you to kind of bring your awareness a little bit closer in, and this can be done by either closing your eyes fully, if that feels comfortable, or by just softly gazing off in the near distance in front of you. This is a way to just really reduce the sensory input, increase our focus. And with either eyes shut or a soft gaze, I now invite you just to listen to the sounds that are going on around you, either inside or outside of the space that you're currently in. And the practice is to simply notice without needing to identify what the sound is or even to evaluate your preference for it. And now going more deeply within, I now invite you just to notice yourself in this physical space, noticing your body, noticing perhaps the sensation of your feet on the ground. Notice the sensation of your legs touching the surface of where you're sitting. Maybe even noticing where your hands are resting. Just allowing our physical body to be a place to just invite ourselves into the present moment. And now I invite you to go even more deeply inward, but checking in with yourself this morning. Now checking in with how you're doing at this moment, on this day, this part of your journey. And asking yourself the question, why am I here this morning? What is it that I am seeking? What brought me to participate in this presentation today? And just ask that question and see what comes up. And considering how you answered that question, I now invite you to just take a moment to set an intention for your attendance today. And if it's helpful to just hold that within your heart, go ahead and do that. Or if it's helpful to open your eyes and just take a moment to just write a few words down, just to remind yourself why you are here today. All right, with that, hopefully we feel a sense of transitioning into this space. I appreciate you all taking the time to be here this morning to really try to be aware and intentional in how you are trying to navigate these very strange times. I was thinking about the title of this presentation, Transitioning to Normalcy. And it brought to mind how, on one hand, when we go through tremendous upheaval of our norms, we sort of want things to go back to how we know them to be. And at the same time, if we were to think about all the various ways in which we have gone through changes in our lives, things very rarely ever go back exactly to how they were. And one of the things that came to mind when you think in terms of on a global scale, certainly on a national scale, is I thought back, almost 2 decades ago to 9/11 and how in an instant our world in the United States changed. There are many things in our world that are different now than they were prior to 9/11. And for us, they've kind of become our new normal. And as with the COVID-19, that will happen too. I think as well about how there were many really beautiful things that came out of 9/11. At the time, I remember feeling the sense of tremendous connection, the sense of tremendous gratitude that we felt. Seeing hundreds of flags flying in my neighborhood and just having my heart swell with the sense that we were all in it together. But it is also helpful to remind ourselves that at that same time, we did something which is a very normal and human thing to do, which is we sort of offloaded our pain, offloaded our suffering by focusing our energy kind of on a common enemy and really expanded that out, generalized that out. And also thinking about how perhaps at the time we felt a tremendous sense of gratitude towards our first responders. And yet there's the painful recognition that 20 years later, there was a tremendous fight to make sure that those first responders who were still surviving were being cared for. I remind us of that period of time because in our discussion today, during this period of time, we can do things differently. We can learn how to be present and create space and go through this process of change, taking responsibility and ownership for all the various feelings that arise, and try to be as intentional about what we would like to do in the present, as well as also moving forward, especially with the first responders that we have now. So in this presentation, I sort of view in two parts. The first part is I'm going to lay a foundation of some understanding of how do we, what is our natural innate tendency when we respond to change. And I think it's helpful for us to recognize those things, because sometimes we can find ourselves engaging in behaviors or getting caught up in things that we can feel judgmental towards. And so it's helpful to recognize why we end up being pulled in certain directions, so that we can have some acceptance and some compassion towards those tendencies, as well as also to choose how to rise above them. I also want to make sure that we have some space today to really do a little hands-on practice of what it might look like to turn towards and to be with and process through some of this loss and change and move towards transformation. Now, in a setting like this, with the amount of time that we have, I want to invite you to really understand what you need. And by that I mean is that for some of you, it may feel very comfortable to be able to do some of the reflection exercises I'll guide you in. And for some of you, it may feel too overwhelming. I'm really grateful that this is being recorded. So for those of you who either want to return to the exercises and go more deeply, or who want to maybe return to them and try them for the first time, have that flexibility. If in any of the discussion we have or any of the practices you start to feel overwhelmed, remind yourself back to what we did at the very beginning and maybe pull back, look around your room, see what you see, listen to the sounds. Do what you need to do to feel more settled. So our program today, we're going to go through talking about our relationship to change, kind of understanding our basic biology and how we're wired. Really take a look at our relationship with hope, fear, loss, and acceptance. Talk a little bit about the difference between change versus transformation, how the practices of mindfulness and self-compassion can be helpful. And also I have a tremendous amount of resources of some books and websites, and certainly a plethora of apps you can use you can use on your phone to continue your practice. Rhoda is also going to be sending out a link. I felt, this shows both a little bit of our foresight as well as also how normal the process of change is. But Samaritan Counseling Center's annual report just came out, and the topic was change and transformation. So there are a lot of tremendous articles in there that I definitely would encourage you to follow the link and read some of those. So to begin with, a couple of really helpful quotes, again, that remind us how normal this process is. And from Mary Shelley in Writing in Frankenstein, "Nothing is so painful to the human mind as a great and sudden change." Change is one of those things that we are constantly trying to defend against, we're trying to plan for, or we're trying to control. And yet it is something that is all around us all the time. I often say to clients, one of my favorite quotes, if you want consistency, then expect change. When we expect things to be as they are, we are very frequently sorely disappointed and often returning to a sense of groundlessness and a sense of fear. So if we can see things as fluid and always in kind of motion, then at least we can prepare ourselves to be present with that. Oftentimes, I meet with people in my office who are there because whatever it is in their world that they have been tolerating has fallen apart. And now they are ready to make a change. Once they've kind of walked the walk through that process, sometimes we look back on that change and we think, how brave we were, or how wonderful it was that we made this change. But I think it's really important to be honest with ourselves that most change happens because we can't stop it. Sometimes things just have to get so bad that change is the only option. Because without things getting so intense, the fear of the unknown, of changing, far exceeds the discomfort with staying with what is familiar until that balance gets tipped. And then we hit the kind of proverbial rock bottom. Oftentimes we get to the other side of the change and we've integrated back into the new normal, and we're now settled back into sort of the sense of things being static again, that we often forget that the process of change is a journey. And so today, I think it's really important for us to talk about kind of what do we do in that liminal space between when things suddenly are different and we can't go back, and we haven't quite figured out what we're moving towards, this liminal space. Paulo Coelho writes, when we least expect it, life sets up a challenge to test our courage and willingness to change. At such a moment, there is no point in pretending that nothing has happened or in saying that we are not yet ready. The challenge will not wait. Life does not look back. So let's understand a little bit of our biology that creates such an intense and often rigid response to change. So Dr. Robert Sapolsky, who wrote a book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, writes an awful lot about kind of our stress response to the environment. And so I want to explain a little bit about how our body was meant to respond to the environment, and how, in many ways, how we as humans tend to interact with the world. So we have both a sympathetic and a parasympathetic nervous system. Parasympathetic is sort of the place that we're kind of meant to hang out in, the relaxed, kind of, enjoying food, getting good sleep, feeling connected. It's our nervous system that is more awakened when we are feeling relaxed. Now, in the case of a zebra, we would be just kind of hanging out on the Serengeti, chomping on grass. The sympathetic nervous system is meant to kick into gear when there's an actual danger, right? So I'm a zebra, I'm hanging out, I'm eating grass, and suddenly there's a lion. So sympathetic nervous system kicks into place like a seesaw. Parasympathetic goes down, sympathetic goes up, my heart rate goes up, there's more blood flow to my muscles, my brain is shutting down, and I'm just focused on survival. Now, once I've run away and the lion is no longer a threat, sympathetic goes down, parasympathetic goes up, and I'm back to chomping on my grass. Now, unfortunately, humans are a lot more alert and a lot more reflective than zebras are. And because of this, we are often responding to not only external threats, but also internal threats. And we call those internal threats to our self-concept. And those are things like, am I, what's going to happen next? What did the person mean in that email? Are they mad at me? I can see something on their face. Did I remember to pay that bill? Right? All of those kind of thinking, gerbil wheel types of things are what keep us constantly, as you can see in that orange line, constantly up at that higher level of stress. So Our parasympathetic nervous system is kind of more often dormant, and we are more often than not kind of living with that constant arousal, that constant threat. And as you can see, that the distance when the zebra actually feels the stress and responds, the difference between the orange line and the real peak of that blue line shows that we don't have a whole lot of space for a new stress to come in. So it's just helpful for us to recognize that that's kind of how our system tends to work, because we are smarter creatures than zebras, for better or for worse. We also have a couple of other things in our system that really sort of set us up for having a very dysregulated response to change. So first of all, when we are even at rest, our mind does not want to stay in the present. Our mind vacillates back and forth between the past and the future, constantly navigating, replaying what has happened so that we can figure out how to be safe in the future, and then trying to foresee the future and control what might happen. Now, the irony of that is that we are not in the present, which is the place where we could keep ourselves safe. And it's the place that mindfulness brings us back to again and again. So recognize we have this default system that takes us out of the present. Second of all, because our system is wired for survival, we are more likely to notice things that can harm us than things that are positive. In fact, actually, John Gottlieb sort of in his research shows it takes 5 positive things to outweigh 1 negative thing. So if you've ever had an experience where you've had a really amazing day and one kind of off thing happens and you find yourself really drawn back to remembering that thing, almost as if it eclipses the rest of the day, it's not because you happen to be a negative person, it's because that's how our brains are wired. Next, we have both a slow and fast part of our brain. The slow part of our brain is the more thoughtful, reflective, executive functioning part of our brain, which really someone could actually label that part of our brain as slow and a bit lazy. The parts of our brain, the midbrain and the hindbrain, are much quicker, and they are also much more paranoid in a way, because they are really just in a very black and white mode, looking to see where the danger is. The midbrain and the hindbrain respond about 7 times faster to what's happening than the thinking, more reflective part of our brain. And if we allow this to just be our default way of being, we will never pause to sort of say, okay, I understand that this is the fear that's kicking up, but let me just pause and have a little space to let that more reflective part of my brain catch up and ask some curious questions rather than just being in panic mode. So again, this is how our brain is wired. Our goal is to recognize that and rise above it. Lastly, the point that I want to make is that when we are under stress, that thinking, reflective, thoughtful part of our brain actually shuts down. If we couch this all in survival, it is important to think about how if you are really in danger, acting is far more important than thinking. So our brain doesn't want to stay in the present. We focus more on the negative. We are more likely to react out of our more paranoid parts of our brain. And when we're really stressed, the thinking, reflective part of our brain will shut down. This happens for all of us. And so pausing, recentering, and getting some space to kind of recenter ourselves becomes very important so that we can rise above, even if temporarily, our natural tendency. Many of you are very familiar with how we have a fight, flight, or freeze system when we are reacting to an external stress. But it is also important to recognize that when we experience an internal threat, rather than fighting externally, we will engage in self-criticism. Now, when I teach classes, I often ask people to raise their hand if they have a self-critic, and we have a lot to cover, so I'm not going to pause, but I imagine there would be a lot of raised hands right now. So we don't fight externally, we fight ourselves. If we experience an internal threat, rather than fleeing, we will isolate and withdraw. And rather than freezing, what we do is called over-identification, where basically we become so flooded with the experience we can't think straight. The practices of mindfulness and self-compassion are wonderful antidotes to these. So instead of engaging in self-criticism, we can offer ourselves the same kind of self-kindness that we offer to others. Instead of isolating, we can remind ourselves that we are perfectly imperfect, messy humans, and that everybody else around us is as well. There's a great quote by Khalil Gibran that says something like, if we all were to sit around and disclose our sins, we'd be embarrassed by our lack of originality. So the common humanity reminds us, I am not alone. And lastly, mindfulness is very helpful, that rather than being flooded and overwhelmed, we can bring ourselves into the present and really try to see what's there, rather than all of our stories and fears. So that is an understanding of our biology, so that we can recognize kind of what we're working with and what we're going to slip into as a default, unless we really sort of recenter and re-engage with a little bit more space. Richard Rohr states, all great spirituality is about what we do with our pain. Creation has a pattern of wisdom, and we dare not shield ourselves from it, or we literally will lose our soul. Death and resurrection are lived out of every level of the cosmos, but only one species thinks it can avoid it, the human species. Hope is an important thing to have, but oftentimes what we really are engaging in is a delusional type of hope, a hope that things would be different than they are. In the book, When Things Fall Apart, Buddhist nun Pema Chodron writes, without giving up hope, that there's somewhere better to be, that there's someone better to be, we will never relax with where we are or who we are. And so part of the process of being with what is kind of giving up that delusional hope, that magical thinking that things will be different than they are, which we do to try to protect ourselves. But the irony again is that we think it protects us, but hope and fear are so connected that we often create more suffering for ourselves by trying to control our reality. We are wired to avoid pain and to move towards pleasure. And so it's understandable that it is hard to turn towards the sense of grief, the sense of loss that we are experiencing in general with experiences of change, but especially right now. And part of the work is learning how to trust ourselves, learning how to tend to ourselves so that we can ride the way through the experience, to become wiser from the experience rather than simply resisting it. And we move towards acceptance. Now, acceptance can be a bit of a loaded word because we have lots of meaning that we already overlay on acceptance. So I want to be really clear that when I say acceptance, I really mean more acknowledgement of what is versus being okay with it. So that's an important distinction. Sharon Salzberg writes, don't pick a fight with reality. And oftentimes we do pick a fight with reality, and we expend a tremendous amount of energy. We cause ourselves and the people around us a tremendous amount of suffering, not wanting to accept things as they are. The beauty of accepting things as they are is we can then take that energy, and rather than being caught in a really unproductive process, we can shift to the question, given this, whatever this is, given this, what do I need? And then we can put our energy into thinking about how to take care of ourselves, how to be present with the people around us. It's a much more productive conversation, but we have to turn towards the pain with an open heart, with curiosity, in order to move towards acceptance. And so that is part of what I am hoping for us to really sort of see what that looks like today. Pema Chodron writes, the healing comes from letting there be room for all of this to happen. Room for grief, room for relief, for misery, for joy. So that was an awful lot of information that I just sort of threw at you. So let's just pause for a minute and see if there's any questions related to what I've kind of laid out so far. And in this sharing space, I hope that I can still see the chat. Oops. Let's see. Okay.
I haven't received any chatted questions, and I don't see any raised hands currently.
All right.
Bianca, you can give questions either way. If you have a question, you can chat it to us, or you can raise your hand and ask it directly.
And how does one raise their hand?
Oh, well, go ahead.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Good morning.
Good morning, Leslie. My name is Bianca. I'm actually joining you from overseas, so I'm probably the only one not in Lancaster County. On understanding our biology, the fight, flight, and freeze, and then we're looking at, that's what we do for external threats, and then moving into internal threats, and you mentioned self-criticism. Is there an example or two that you might give us for how, common ways that we self-criticize? That was the one aspect of that slide that I couldn't quite connect to.
Well, so first of all, I think that it's wonderful in some ways that maybe that is even a question. Because I think sometimes people are very ready with their list of general criticisms that they make towards themselves. So I think it's helpful to have an opportunity even to be able to flesh that out a little bit more. I think oftentimes when we are experiencing a tremendous amount of pain or discomfort, one of the ways in which we find ourselves trying to sort of control what's happening is to find someone to blame. And so sometimes that can be shooting that outwards and blaming a particular group. But more often than not, we will blame ourselves. I should have done this. I shouldn't have done that. I should be stronger. I should be more thoughtful. Beating ourselves up for the ways in which we are reacting to those around us, which kind of creates a vicious cycle. Like, I'm not allowed to take care of myself because that's selfish, but now I feel horrible because I just acted out because I didn't take care of myself. It's like the gift that kind of keeps on giving, right, in that cycle. So when we take the blame on ourselves, it is painful, but it kind of ties the unknown up. Like, right, it's like, okay, unknown, resolved. We've just figured out that the reason why any of this is happening is because I am an awful and horrible person, right? Mm-hmm. And so, and this is why I'm not worthy of love. And this is why I'm not in a relationship, or this is why I'm not making more money, or this is why I weigh more than I want. All of those reasons that we start to criticize ourselves for are really just ways to distract ourselves from being with the fact that whatever we're dealing with is hard and often contains a lot of things that we can't control and a lot of things that we don't know yet. Does that help?
Makes perfect sense. Thank you.
Great, excellent. Thank you for the question. Yeah. Rhoda, are there any other questions that?
I haven't had any other questions come in, so I think you can keep going.
Great, okay. I always feel like it's dangerous when you let an Enneagram 7 do a presentation. Always going to throw the kitchen sink in. Okay, here we go. All right. So as I often say in the class that I teach, let's shift now from theory into practice. So I'm going to invite you to identify something right now that is maybe part of all of these intense and rapid changes, to pick something that you know has been causing you some suffering. Now, this is the caveat. I imagine that all of us could pick something that feels kind of minimal, and we all could probably pick something that knocks us off our chair in this very moment. It's really hard to learn if you pick something from those extremes. So I invite you to maybe identify something kind of in the middle, something that has been a change, that has, created a loss, created some inconvenience, that when you think about, you can almost kind of just even feel some of the discomfort in your body. And again, if you are in a place right now, literally in a place right now, or just figuratively for yourself to not do this exercise, just allow yourself to listen to it, knowing you can always come back to do this later. But if you are, go ahead and just take a minute to see if you can identify something. And maybe if you have some paper in front of you, maybe just write down what that is so that you don't have to just completely hold it in your mind. Now, I don't imagine people still need some time to pick something, so I'll proceed. So I invite you to close your eyes either fully or partially and just really connect into your awareness of this change, this loss that you have identified. And as you connect into as many of the details around this, to drop out of our minds, drop out of the story in our head, and connect into what you're noticing in your body. There's a reason why we call them feelings. They actually show up in our body first. So see if you can notice anything in your body. Just notice where you might be holding this. You might be feeling something in your chest or in your belly, maybe even in your neck or your head. But just see where the discomfort is residing. And we're just observing it. We're not trying to change it or make it go away. We're just observing that it's there. Now see if you can identify the feeling or feelings that kind of fuel this physical sensation. Are you feeling anger? Are you feeling sadness? Are you feeling fear? Anxiety? Loneliness? Now, whatever it is that you're feeling, we're just labeling what we're feeling without judgment, just simply noticing what's there. Most of us are much better at being kind to other people than we are to ourselves. And so perhaps maybe even think about if you were talking to somebody else, a dear friend, a loved one who was going through and feeling what you're feeling right now. Imagine how you would just validate their experience. Like, this is hard. Yes, this is sadness. This hurts. Again, we're not trying to make it go away, and we're not trying to fix it. We're just simply acknowledging what's there. Knowing at any time, if it becomes overwhelming, you can kind of pull out of the practice. But if you can just stay or return back to the practice, just recognizing that we can create space for these feelings without them knocking us over. So this is bringing the practice of mindfulness, of awareness of what is here. Now, sometimes judgment can come up because we can feel very alone in how we feel. And so I invite you to consider that you are not alone in how you're feeling. That collectively, we are all feeling the feelings that are arising. It may not be about exactly the same thing, but if someone were to be feeling or have experienced what you have experienced, your response would probably be pretty normal. And so taking a moment to recognize, this is a human response. I am not alone in this. This is how most people would feel. And this is where we are bringing the practice of common humanity to feel that connection, if even a connection in our suffering. And now, because we are feeling this way, and because we are taking the tentative steps to try to be with what is here, offering ourselves some compassion can help us to create this space. So perhaps maybe connecting back in again to this loss, to this point of pain and grief, this change, and feeling once again in your body where it is residing. And now I invite you to just place a hand or hands on that spot, wherever it is feeling the most intense. And if it's feeling kind of all over your body, maybe just place your hands on your heart. Now, this is the same way that we would offer a hand of comfort to a loved one, to someone dear to us. So allow our own hand to be a source of comfort, feeling the warmth of your own hand, the pressure of your own hand, inclining towards the suffering with some kindness and tenderness. There. And because of this suffering, and because of trying to create space for this suffering, perhaps there are some words of kindness that you need to hear. And these are not words to fix or make the experience go away, but words to support you to be with what you are experiencing. And so take a moment to maybe whisper in your own ear what you'd really need to hear at this moment. Knowing that if you have some trouble, because maybe this isn't familiar, maybe think about some soothing words you might offer to someone else and see if you can offer those to yourself. And perhaps now taking a moment to consider, given this, what do I need? What would be most helpful to support me in navigating the reality of this? Take a moment to just think a little bit about what would be helpful. Again, not to fix or change the reality, but what do you need to be with the reality? Answering the question, what do I need, is often something we haven't really been given permission to ask ourselves. So if you're having a little trouble, then maybe just bring some compassion to that. Now, when you're ready, I invite you to open your eyes and maybe take a moment just to write down kind of what you observed, what came up for you in doing that practice. And taking just about another few minutes, a few moments to just finish up your thoughts, knowing you can always come back to continue to explore this question. And now setting your writing aside and just closing your eyes again, either fully or partially. And I just want to share a poem with you that I think really encapsulates the importance of learning to be with. So closing your eyes again, either fully or partially, just settling back down into the present moment with a couple of deep breaths. And I offer you the words from Rumi in his poem, The Guest House. This, being human, is a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all. Even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture, still treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whomever comes because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. And now just taking a few deep breaths at your own pace. What you were able to connect into with this practice will be helpful with us for the second practice. But whenever we're finished doing hard work like this, I always like to take a moment to take care of ourselves. So I invite everybody to maybe just get up from where they're sitting. If you want to turn your camera off for a minute, but just get up for a moment and just move your body and stretch for a little bit and allow yourself to really just kind of take care of yourself physically. And just coming back whenever you're ready. Sometimes on these Zoom sessions, we forget to move ourselves. And so hopefully that was at least a little bit of a helpful pause. So are there any questions about that practice? Okay. Are we good to go? All right, great. Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit about change. One of my really wonderful colleagues, David Miron, who heads up our clergy and congregational care and is just an all-around good egg, wrote a really wonderful article in the annual report about change versus transition versus transformation. And crediting him here, I kind of used some of his language because honestly, I couldn't have said it better myself. But a reminder again of sort of the importance of being with our experiences of change. And I'm drawing from a number of different traditions. So I'm hoping you're recognizing that, I mean, this is a truth that runs and weaves through so many different things. But Lao Tzu writes, life is a series of natural and spontaneous changes. Don't resist them. That only creates sorrow. Let reality be reality. Let things flow naturally forward in whatever way they like. So some of the words that I gleaned from David, first of all, change and transition and transformation kind of on the surface are the same thing. But it really, I think in many ways is kind of reflective of both the intensity of it, as well as also the choices that we make around it. Change and transition, is something I feel that kind of happens to us, right? Whereas transformation is something more where we are participating in the process. It involves really not only kind of the change of the reality, but how we allow ourselves to be wiser and to shift in our perception towards ourselves and also towards our world around us. And often those changes really are about acceptance and coming to a place of peace with what is. Perhaps even at peace with who we are and how we feel and what we are experiencing. A lot of what is reflected in the practices that we are kind of just touching on today. And it's also really important to be able to live with the contradictions of our life, integrating both the parts that we can feel more easily at peace with, as well as also the parts of us that we struggle to be more at ease with, but are still there nonetheless. In some ways, that's kind of what Carl Jung was referencing when he talks about that shadow side. And Parker Palmer in his wonderful book, Hidden Wholeness, about kind of really integrating all of ourselves into ourselves so that we are able to befriend those parts of our experience or those parts of ourselves that maybe are harder to relate to, but they're there nonetheless. So part of our transformation is choosing how we relate to them as well. Socrates wrote, "The secret of change is to focus all of your energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new." I think this is an important quote of kind of the before the change and after the change, and that liminal space that we are really trying to be with today is that part that we have to be with before we can start building the change. Unless we come to a place of acceptance, and unless we process through our suffering to come to a place of acceptance, we are more likely to quickly try to rebuild what we knew from before the change, rather than trying to create some space to be curious about what is new, what is different, and think about how we are going to integrate those things into building the new. Rumi is always such a source of wisdom, and he writes, "Yesterday I was clever, so I wanted to change the world. Today I am wise, so I am changing myself." So I invite you now again, we're going to do another little practice, and this time really trying to see how we can begin this process of curiosity and transformation. So I invite you to return back to what you selected for the first practice. And I want you to take a moment again, either closing your eyes, either fully or partially. And I want you to think a little bit about, what is it about this particular thing that you picked? What is it about it that has caused so much suffering? What is so important to you? What do you value that this caused this level of suffering? So take a moment and see if you can check in. Why is this piece, why is this piece so important? And really, that's a question of curiosity, not a question of dismissiveness. Like, really, why? Why is this important to me? What does this reflect in my life that I value? If I can go underneath the specific details of this thing, what does it represent to me? How was this important to my life? And see if you can go down deeper into the value that this thing, that this loss or change represented. Maybe perhaps you've picked just the difficulty of staying at home. And so maybe that represents the importance of connection. Or maybe that represents the importance of adventure and exploration and travel. Perhaps there are aspects where this just represents the importance of safety. Whatever it may be, I invite you just to see if you can really kind of just lean into the importance that underlies that particular change or loss for you. And when you've identified what it is, go ahead and maybe just write a little bit to yourself, just to really help capture that for you. And just finishing up your thoughts, knowing you can always come back to do some more writing. Now, with what kind of came into hopefully a little bit more clarity for you of, what was so important that made this change or loss important and painful for you, can you take a moment to see if you can identify a few things, even if it's just one thing, but if you can identify a few things that you can recognize in your life right now, in the circumstances of our life right now, that you are still doing that helps you to honor how important this thing is for you, this value is for you. How are you still embodying that, if even in small ways? So see if you can just take a moment to identify what is still here. You might even recognize that there are some new things that you have started to engage in, given the shift and change in our context now that you weren't doing before. And now expanding the question and ask yourself, maybe there are some things that you hadn't even thought of doing now because we were so focused on the changes and the constraints. But if you were to just step back and say, are there some other things that I could also begin doing equally as valid? Are there some things that I could maybe stop doing? But what are some changes that I might be able to make to really right now, even given this context of where we are, where I could live more fully into this thing that I've identified as important to me? And just finishing up your thoughts. Now, I invite you to take a look at what you have written so far around what you can recognize that you're already doing, and what are some things that you can recognize that you can either begin doing now or discontinue doing now. And just allow yourself to feel even a sense of gratitude for what you are already doing for yourself, as well as also to recognize that this reflects what is within your control. And just notice how that feels in your body. And if it feels good, then just savor that. And if you're still feeling some suffering, just offer some tenderness towards that too. And I definitely invite you to consider this exercise as something that you can come back to as many times as you need to, as well as also using it to kind of delve more deeply into other things that you can connect into that create a sense of loss, a sense of suffering because of change. Just allowing yourself again to be present with those feelings, to create some space for it, to allow it to help you to recognize what is so important that this change or loss is creating suffering. And allow that to be a point of open-hearted curiosity to begin to examine ways in which to live right now, not in the future, but right now. What are the things that you can do? And continue to come back to that question. So I'm wondering if we could just take a few minutes, if anybody is willing to maybe share what that process was like for you or what you noticed. If anybody wants to wave a little hand, or if they, okay. All right. Jill, is that a little wave hand there?
Yeah, I'm moving to a more private place.
Okay.
Yeah, I put the item that I chose is I was laid off, and then on May 1st, I realized, or I was told by my boss that he didn't anticipate being able to call me back until anytime in 2020, just because of lack of demand. And so the items that I wrote for causing so much suffering is just the loss of connections. That it's a job that very much gets me out of my white circles, my bubbles.
Mhm.
And I very much appreciated that part of my job. And that was part of the reason I took the job. And so just a loss of how am I going to be able to create those types of connections, so that, and also just the loss of feeling like I was part of advocating for those who, just advocating
Yeah.
for particularly women and people of color. So, yeah, and then, what am I still doing to honor that? I am still connecting with a couple coworkers who are in my same situation, who are also people of color.
Mm.
I did sign up for a COVID/racism online program that's June 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, which
Great.
I really wouldn't have time to do. And I'm contemplating participating in a STAR training at EMU in September.
Hmm.
I
What is
really,
this STAR training?
well, I forget what it stands for, but it's something trauma. Maybe somebody else is able to write it in, but it's an acronym for something with trauma.
Hmm.
And there's level 1 and 2. I would do level 1. I'm not that familiar with it, but just because of everybody experiencing trauma, no matter what our situation because of the pandemic.
Yeah.
So, that is what, and also possibly I've been wanting to visit a museum down south, maybe in the fall. I don't know, but anyway, so thank you, because I wouldn't have probably gotten to some of that thinking without this. So thank you.
Wonderful. And we had one of the other attendees that STAR is Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience.
Yes.
So thank you, Bianca, for sharing that.
Thank
And I appreciate, Jill, in many ways, it's an interesting to, we often are looking so much at the door that's closed that we don't look at the doors that open. And so I'm glad that in this space, you were able to connect into some things that maybe were opportunities that might have been like, oh, that would have been great, but I don't have time for it. And that can be how you use the space now, as well as also how that then shifts and transforms you when it is ready to re-engage in a new way. So thank you for sharing that and your vulnerability, for being able to share that, and as well as also the work that you're doing. So thank you very much. Yeah. Looks like we have another. Yes. Hi.
Hi, I'm Sandy.
Hi, Sandy.
I really like that exercise because I really started to think, what do I love to do? Well, I love to travel, and now I can't do that. And connect with people and learn new things. So what I've been doing every single day, I have been walking, and I do about 25 miles a week.
Great.
And what I've found while I'm walking is people really want to connect with you. They want to say hello, for that, I keep that 6-foot physical distance.
Sure.
But we have conversations. And I've found in my community that there's this sense of community. I know my neighbors, they ask me if they can go shopping for me. But what I do, as I said, I walk, I connect with people. I get out and do exercise, which is good for me and I think good for my mental health.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I've been doing, and I found that to be very important.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. And it's interesting, you know, sometimes the curiosity and the exploration that motivates us to go far and wide with our travels. You know, sometimes it's really neat when we can actually bring that curiosity and awe to our just local vicinity as well, and just savor what's around us. So thank you very much for sharing. And exercise, saying good morning, you know, those are such important things that we often don't find time for. So thank you very much for that sharing as well.
Thank you.
Maybe we have just time for one more sharing before we move on. Yes, Glenn.
Walkers really do like to connect and talk.
Mm.
Wherever you walk, I started walking around the hospital near where I live. It's a safe route, it's a scenic route, and it's a popular route. Then I decided I needed a more challenging walk, so I walked in my neighborhood, which is very hilly, but people are walking on both sides of the street in that instance, and you don't have to be concerned about the distance. The other thing that it affords me personally is it's very challenging in terms of getting my heart rate up. It's not longer. It's not more difficult. It's just the incline is more
Well, Glenn, I'm
significant.
so glad that getting out in nature and walking around has been something that you found to be
Because I'm a gym person
helpful.
and I can't go to the gym.
Great, thank you so much. And it's nice to be able to see that we have our gym right outside our house.
Yes.
So thank you. Yeah. So I hope that you consider the sort of framework of this exercise of turning towards whatever it is that we are experiencing. And I just wanted to just share a little bit as far as with kind of the practices that we have done here, so that you may be kind of a little bit more familiar kind of with understanding what the steps were. Whoops. Okay, so first of all, we used the mindfulness practices to bring that sense of kind of anchoring and centering in the very beginning of the presentation. It's always important to remember that finding some safe place to come back to can be so important, so that the ground underneath our feet can feel solid as we start to open up to whatever it is that we are experiencing. Feeling untethered like that is often the reason why we don't try. So if we can trust ourselves that we can come back to, you know, what we see and what we hear and how our body feels, we can always come back to that and then just simply begin again. When we started to connect into something that caused us suffering, I invited you to both label the feelings that might be underneath and kind of fueling that suffering. Knowing what our emotion is or emotions are can be really helpful, because they can sort of inform what we need. So being able to kind of get connected into the different feelings, and there are some really wonderful emotion lists that you can download from the internet and just kind of have at hand to reference sometimes, especially if maybe we haven't been given permission in our lives to really explore our emotional world. So we labeled the emotion, and as well as also we found the emotion in our body. One of the benefits, many benefits of finding the emotion in our body, is that we get out of the story that we are swirling around in our head of, you know, who did what and who did what to whom and who should have, all that sort of junk, and really get down and get present with the suffering that we are experiencing. Additionally, when we find it in our body, that's literally then a place we can offer soothing. And again, we're not trying to make it go away. We're just locating and tending to what we are experiencing. Mindfulness is really about what it is that we are experiencing. And the compassion practice is really kind of about taking that experience and kind of wrapping a relationship of kindness around our experience so that we are being tender to ourselves and open-hearted towards our experience. So rather than kind of getting caught up in the what should have happened or shouldn't have happened, it happened. So at this point, getting into, given that this has happened, what is it that I need? So those are the mindfulness and the compassion practices. And I specifically want to kind of recommend that you explore more intentionally a wonderful practice that Tara Brach, a psychologist and meditation teacher, offers, which is the acronym RAIN. And we really did that today. First of all, recognizing what is happening, allowing our experience to be there, which of course the compassion practice make that easier to do. Investigating our experience with kindness, being curious about what is this? What is happening? What is this trying to tell me, right? What can I learn from this? And then the end being non-identification, where rather than being so caught up and attached to the suffering or attached to the loss, we can hold some space from it and recognize that these are parts of life. So RAIN is a really nice acronym also to kind of remind us to slow things down and to be in that liminal space between the change and the new normal. So we're not so quick to try to simply fix what it is that we're experiencing, because whatever fix we're going to come up with is only fixing with the tools we already know. We don't allow for space and curiosity to learn some new things. Now, sometimes when I start talking about self-compassion, we recognize that many of us have a real resistance to compassion. And so I just wanted to address that really quickly as well. So sometimes when we start talking about being compassionate with ourselves, I hear from students, from clients during presentations, that anything that starts with the word self is immediately deemed as selfish. And so therefore, we're not allowed to do it, because being selfish is not who we want to be. We also sometimes get this message that self-compassion is weak somehow, that maybe it's kind of having our own little pity party for ourselves. Some people may even feel that self-compassion is not only selfish, but it's also quite indulgent, that we will just lose all motivation, we'll just accept that we're messy people and don't take any responsibility, right? All of these perceptions. So mindful self-compassion as a program was developed by Chris Germer and Kristen Neff. And Kristen Neff is one of the preeminent researchers in self-compassion. And she has directly herself, as well as also supported, a tremendous amount of research on self-compassion. So let me tell you a little bit about what the research shows. People who are higher in levels of self-compassion are actually more willing to take responsibility. And the reason why that is because the common humanity, right? That aspect of, I am a messy and imperfect individual, and so is everybody else. And I am not the first person on this planet who's ever done this, whatever this thing is that I've done, or ever gone through this thing that I'm going through. And so compassion allows us to not get sucked into that shame storm that Brene Brown talks about, where we start to feel alone and isolated. So we can more easily take responsibility for our actions. because we recognize that our control is not in what's going on out here, but our control is in how we relate to what's going on out here, how we tend to ourselves given what's going on out here, right? And so because of that, we can trust ourselves more, and we're more willing to be vulnerable and to have courage, even in the face of suffering. Again, that sense of feeling connected, rather than suddenly I'm in kind of narcissistically over here licking my wounds, is not what self-compassion is about. That common humanity of, and this, whatever it is that I'm experiencing right now, connects me to every being on this planet. That common humanity helps us to stop feeling uniquely broken, uniquely unworthy of love, uniquely isolated. Because we also are focusing more on our process and not so much on the outcome, because we can't control the outcome 100%, but because we focus on the process, we can recognize that, we're going to try hard things, and sometimes it'll work as we expect. It will always work. It's just whether it's how we actually thought it would work. And sometimes it doesn't work. And rather than being caught up in, this is a failure, we can recognize, where is the opportunity for learning here? How can I be wiser for next time? So people with compassion, high levels of self-compassion, are actually very motivated and probably more likely, actually the research says more likely, to take on harder risks because there isn't such a fear of failing. When we are more responsible for ourselves, then we are more likely to do what we need to do to be centered and grounded as much as we can by healing and tending to and processing through, so we're not spilling our suffering out on everybody else around us. So far from being selfish, it's incredibly responsible to be compassionate and tend to ourselves. And as well, because we are able to turn towards our suffering with an open heart and with curiosity, and to trust that we can kind of ride the wave through rather than resist, then we actually have a higher level of resilience when we can foster more self-compassion. And that is based on, many, maybe I think at this point, probably close to 3,000 different research studies that have been done on self-compassion. So as we come to the end of our time, I do want to create some space now to answer questions that you may have. And please remember that you can always reach out and contact me by email if maybe you have a question that you don't feel comfortable with asking right here in the middle of Zoom. And at the end, I'd just like to leave about just 10 minutes for us to do a little practice at the end, to just give you one more skill that you can use to allow yourself to feel centered and grounded. So with that, I'd like to open up, I guess, if there's any questions, Rhoda, that you've received, or any questions that people have. I know I've thrown an awful lot of stuff at you.
Well, I think I will ask one question, probably on behalf of a few people joining in today. Some people I know were signing up for this workshop because of work they wanted to do for themselves. And some people were coming because of the care they give to others through their work or through their church. And so any suggestions or adaptations on how you work through some of these things for other people, or how you help other people in this kind of self-compassion?
Absolutely, yeah. So first of all, I think we're all familiar with the airplane oxygen mask metaphor. And that is such an important aspect of how we make sure that we are actually offering these practices to ourselves before we are trying to offer them to others. For two reasons. One, because if you think it's hard to sit with and be present with your own suffering without wanting to distract or fix, think about what it's like trying to be present with somebody else's suffering without trying to want to jump in to solve, fix, right? So the more that we can actually work on being centered and grounded for ourselves, the more it is possible for us to be present for others. I think also that the more we appreciate how being with, turning towards the suffering, and working through with curiosity, I think that we are then able to have the patience to hold the space to allow others to do that. You know, because we are such empathic creatures, when we come face to face with somebody else's suffering, we feel suffering. And, you know, unintentionally, we will want to resolve, tie up, end, sever, eradicate the other person's suffering as quickly as possible so that we don't have to sit with what it's bringing up within us, right? And in fact, actually, the last practice for today is one specifically for how do we kind of, how do we hold space for the other person while we tend to ourselves. But so I think first we always have to start with learning for ourselves, because then we can both appreciate why it's so important to hold the space. We also can appreciate that it's not easy to hold the space. You know, I have a 5-year-old daughter now, and I often laugh. First 4 years of my career as a therapist, I worked as a family therapist. And I often joke, you know, I really want to send apology notes back to all those parents that I gave quick advice to, having no idea what it was really like having a child. And so I think that if we are willing to do the work for ourselves and say, yeah, this is not easy stuff, right? This is not just like, oh, turn towards with an open heart, write what you're doing. Oh, we're all good. Now let's move. No, it's not that. It's complicated. It's yucky. It's sticky. And it's about just choosing again and again. Then it's a little bit easier for us to hold some hope that the other person will be able to move through that themselves. And also to encourage them that it's hard, it hurts, but it is worth it. So I think that that's one of the ways in which these practices can be, you know, first starting with ourselves so we can hold that space. And at the same time, you know, what I did here is simply saying, what do you notice? What is there? Don't quickly jump into solve mode. Just notice what's there. Notice in your body so you're not swirling in the story up here. Be with that, tend to it, and then open up with some curiosity. I think that as sort of a process is something that is not particularly magical or mystical. So I would definitely encourage those of you who could use that to sort of be with the people around you, that could also be a gift, just to hold space. And you know, even if it's something as simple as, I know you're going to figure this out. You know, whatever happens, you're going to be okay. It may be hard, but we'll get through this. You know, rather than, here's my 3-point plan to fix your problem. Does that help a little bit, Rhoda? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. And now, Rhoda, are you going to send out, I think you were going to send out a link to the Samaritan annual report if anybody wanted to look at that. And I think we also had a request about maybe my email.
Yeah, so I'm going to send out a follow-up email to everybody that registered. It'll have the presentation, the recording, Leslie's email, the report that she mentioned, as well as some other resources that she recommends. We will have a short evaluation that we'll ask you to complete, because this is how we decide what webinars to offer in the future. And because of the recording takes a little bit of time to process, I don't know if I'll get it out yet today. It'll probably be sent out tomorrow, so you can look for it tomorrow.
We also have, we just recently, with my amazing colleagues at Samaritan Counseling Center, they just recently, and one of the items on the resource page is actually a link to the Change Through Compassion program at Samaritan, which I run. And there's actually, we were able to put up a contact form so that if you wanted to get some more information about the program as well, you can just put your information and then we can get back to you and let you know what's going on with more of our mindfulness and self-compassion offerings. So are there any other questions that anyone would like to offer up? Maybe even if you'd like to just post it to everybody in chat or to just me in chat. See, I joke with my class, I'm both a therapist and a college professor. I can outsit any of you. All right. So let me just take a moment I'm going to pull the slides back up and just sort of point out some of the resources that we have. Okay. So here are a number of really amazing resources. So first being the Change Through Compassion program that I run at Samaritan and our web address to get to more information. If you'd like to learn more about mindful self-compassion, you can go to the centerformsc.org. On the Change Through Compassion website at Samaritan, there is a video that I put up and a link to a YouTube video, a YouTube channel that I created with some videos. But there's also amazing recordings and other support at the Center for MSC as well. As I mentioned, Kristen Neff is one of the co-creators of the program, and she has a wonderful website with great information about research. Pema Chodron's book, When Things Fall Apart, is such a relevant book for right now. And I think actually Krista Tippett, who I was so grateful to see through Paris Resource Center, that in her recent episode of On Being, they were actually discussing that book. Tara Brach has amazing guided meditations and little lectures. Brene Brown, Sharon Salzberg, On Being, as well as also at UC Berkeley, they have a wonderful program, The Greater Good, that has lots of articles that are tremendously helpful. And as well as also Rick Hansen, who has a great website called Wise Brain that has a lot of helpful information too. There are more apps that I could probably shove onto this one slide. So I think, so going through, and these are not all in, I realize they're almost all completely in alphabetical order, although I just recently learned about Abide, so that happens to just be at the bottom just because it was the last one I learned about. But checking out all these, many of them are free. A lot of them are available if you want to share them with your family, with children. So definitely check out some of those, some of them secular, some of them leading into more spiritual faith practices, Buddhist philosophy. So lots of different options available for us. So, okay, whoop. Okay. So as we come to an end with our just last few moments, I want to share with you one of the core practices of mindful self-compassion, and it is the practice called giving and receiving compassion. So I invite you to close your eyes again, either fully or partially. And this is a practice where we're going to connect into our breath, as well as also connect into some visualization and just some kind of gentle words in our mind. So going ahead and closing your eyes, either fully or partially, taking a couple of deep breaths. And I invite you to notice wherever it is the easiest to notice that your body is breathing. So for some of you, it may be easier to notice the gentle expansion of your abdomen, For some of you, it may be easier to notice the gentle rise and fall of your chest. And for some of you, it may be easier to simply notice the physical sensation of the breath at the very tip of your nose. Luckily, our body can breathe without our intervention. So all we're doing is just having the breath be something that's interesting enough for our mind to rest for just a moment in the present. I invite you to check in with yourself, maybe perhaps returning back in your mind to your intention from the very beginning of the practice today, or tapping into some of the wisdom of what came up for you during the writing exercise. And I want you to ask yourself the question, what is it that I need? And what is it that I need in this moment? What is it that I need today or at this point in my journey? And allow word or words to bubble up. Perhaps you really need a sense of peace or health or patience or compassion, or maybe that universal need of love. And without changing the pace of your breathing, I invite you just to breathe in this good thing for yourself. The exhale just happens, but focus your intention on the in-breath, breathing in the word. And if you're a visual person, maybe adding a light or a color to each in-breath. There's nothing you need to do, but just simply allow yourself to breathe in this good thing. And when your mind wanders, which it will, because that's what our mind does, the practice is simply noticing that and gently bringing it back to the breath and reconnecting back into the word as many times as you need to. There's nothing you need to do, but just simply enjoy receiving this good thing. Now, continuing to breathe in this good thing for yourself, I invite you to bring to mind someone towards whom it's just very easy to send goodwill. Or maybe someone you know who's really struggling right now. And envision this person in your mind's eye and think a little bit about what this person might need. Do they need a sense of ease or to feel connected or to feel at peace? And now breathing in a good thing for yourself And now, as you exhale, send out something good to this person, to this being. Breathing in for me and breathing out for you. Just allowing the compassion to flow between you and this other. Just like floating on an ocean of compassion. One for me and one for you. And now releasing the practice and just settling in your breath. I invite you just to receive the words of this poem called Allow by Dana Folds. There is no controlling life. Try corralling a lightning bolt containing a tornado. Dam a stream and it will create a new channel. Resist and the tide will sweep you off your feet. Allow and grace will carry you to higher ground. The only safety lies in letting it all in, the wild and the weak, fear, fantasies, failures, and success. When loss rips off the doors of the heart, or sadness veils your vision with despair, practice becomes simply bearing the truth. In the choice to let go of your known way of being, the whole world is revealed to your new eyes. And now just taking a few deep breaths. And just coming back together as we come to an end. So, Rhoda, I'm not sure if you have any words that you want to share at the end, but I just want to take a moment to just say I'm so appreciative of everybody being willing to take the time to want to learn how to be during this time of great uncertainty and confusion. And try to figure out how to be in a way that creates more grounding for you and for the people around you, because that will make all the difference in the world. So thank you to each and every one of you.
And thank you to you, Leslie, so much for this workshop. It was really wonderful. As I said, everybody, I'll follow up with a lot of these resources to you. I will let you know also that we plan to do another workshop with Leslie in the fall about the longer term and the more societal trauma that's happening right now. And we will let you know some more details about that also when we have everything nailed down. So thank you all for joining us today. We will get those resources sent out, and feel free to send questions to me or to Leslie, and we'll get them answered as best we can. Thank you so much.
Great, excellent. Thank you, everybody.